Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cultural Depot. We are so happy to have you here. Thank you so much for watching. It was Martin Luther King Day, and we did a check-in here at the Cultural Depot. Hopefully, you had an opportunity to get out that day and be of service to your communities because it is considered a day on and not a day off, a day of service. But if not, that is totally fine because we do realize we are in the middle of a pandemic and we want everybody to stay safe and be healthy. So that's why we're here at the Cultural Depot. This is our place to come together and discuss what's going on in our communities and ways that we can move our communities forward. For this MLK Day Check-In, we talked about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We talked about his active service to our community and the legacy and instructions that he left for us in one of his final sermons entitled Remaining Awake During a Revolution. So, without further ado, let's get started. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born Michael King Jr. on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, to his parents, Alberta and Michael King Sr. He had two siblings, an older sister, Christine, and a younger brother, Alfred. King was raised in Atlanta and came from a lineage of pastors that included his grandfather and his dad, so he was entrenched in the Baptist ministry. His father was a 1930 graduate of Morehouse College and immediately following graduation became the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, which at the time was a staple in Atlanta with a large congregation that did much work for the Atlanta community. His father was also a civil rights activist. He served on the executive committee of the NAACP chapter in Atlanta. He also served as an officer to the Civic and Political League. When King was 5 years old, his father traveled to Germany with the Baptist World Alliance and learned of the Protestant reform leader Martin Luther. With great inspiration, he changed his name and that of his sons to Martin Luther King. At 15 years old, Martin Luther King graduated high school and began studies at Morehouse College. He graduated from Morehouse at the age of 19 and went on to seminary school in Pennsylvania, and then on to Boston University. While at Boston University, he became a graduate member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And in 1953, he met and married a young activist and music major, Coretta Scott. He was 24 years old. He then graduated from Boston University with his doctorate in seminary in 1955 and moved to Montgomery, Alabama, where he became the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. They also started their young family that year with the birth of their first daughter, Yolanda. They enjoyed their time together early on. They were young, around the ages of 26 and 27. So it is important to remember that when we see him, when we see this iconic figure, we know we still remember him as a father figure. Yet some of us have now reached the age he never reached. We're beyond 40. And so it is important to make sure we take the time to remember that Martin Luther King was still in his 20s when he was thrust into the movement. He was compelled to lead as a young man. In 1955, when a 42-year-old activist, Rosa Parks, decided she would not give up her bus seat to a white man, she was arrested, and her arrest drew the attention of Dr. Martin Luther King, who agreed to spearhead the Montgomery bus boycott. King, like so many others at the time, put himself in harm's way and was arrested. He was later released into the arms of his wife, Coretta. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days, which puts into perspective the amount of time that we must devote to making change in our community. The boycott ended successfully with the integration of the Montgomery transportation system in December of 1956. In January of 1957, with the success of the bus boycott as a catalyst, Dr. King founded the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, in order to organize the activities of the civil rights movement in the South and across the country. By May of 57, he was standing before his first national audience in Washington, D.C., delivering his Give Us the Ballot speech as part of the prayer pilgrimage for freedom. In the same year, he released his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, an account of the Montgomery bus boycott. The success of the Montgomery bus boycott and the founding of a new national organization drew attention from all areas, good and bad. In 1958, while at a book signing in Harlem, Dr. King was actually stabbed with a letter opener by a black woman, Izola Curry, who thought he was a communist. She stabbed him that afternoon in broad daylight. So by the age of 29, someone had already made an attempt on Dr. King's life. The attempt on his life did not deter him from his continued commitment to advancing our community forward. He went on in 1958 and 59 to lead 2 marches to integrate schools. By 1960, King was back at Ebenezer Baptist Church delivering sermons. He would be appointed co-pastor alongside his father. In the summer of 1961, King joins the Freedom Riders of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, to challenge segregation practices in the Deep South that persist in spite of the Supreme Court rulings. In 1962, Dr. King and the SCLC in Chicago started Operation Breadbasket, where Reverend Jesse Jackson was made the leader. Operation Breadbasket was put in place to advocate for equal and fair employment. And if a business did not employ blacks, every minister in Chicago would tell their congregation not to patronize that business. Dr. King felt it was his most successful project with the SCLC. In 1963, Dr. King went to Birmingham, Alabama. Drawn there by the brutal injustices that were taking place, he wanted to make sure that the people of Birmingham were a part of the movement. While in Birmingham, he was arrested, and it was there, during his time spent in jail, that he penned his most famous letters from the Birmingham jail. In this letter, we can see what drew Dr. King to Birmingham at the time. He talked about the injustices that were taking place in Birmingham, and it is also in this letter that we can find one of his most famous quotes: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Later that year, he went on to the March on Washington, where he delivered another famous speech in front of a crowd of hundreds of thousands. It was his "I Have a Dream" speech, in which he talked about coming to the Capitol to cash a check. He said that America wrote a check the day it wrote the Constitution and Declaration of Independence that said all men, including black men, were granted the unalienable right of liberty in the pursuit of happiness. But he said when we came to cash our check, it was a bad check. The promissory note that they wrote was in default, and the check had come back marked insufficient funds. In 1964, Dr. King began to forge a new relationship with Malcolm X as the two began to see each other's points of view from different perspectives. Unfortunately, we know that this would be their one and only meeting, as less than a year later, in February of 1965, Malcolm X would go on to be assassinated. Dr. King would go on to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. At this time, he had the full ear of President Lyndon B. Johnson as he worked on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1965, Dr. King participated in 3 marches from Selma to Montgomery in an effort to obtain the right to vote. He, linked arm in arm with his wife Coretta and the likes of leaders like John Lewis and Ralph Abernathy, attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The first attempt to march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge became known as Bloody Sunday, as the police brutally bludgeoned and trampled marchers. On the second attempt to cross, Dr. King decided to make the symbolic gesture to turn the crowd around. It wasn't until the third attempt that they successfully crossed from Selma to Montgomery. King was again in talks with the president. President Johnson went on to sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Dr. King was there for the signing, and by this time he had become well known across the nation and over the world. All the while, he was still a young man, trying to balance leading a movement and growing his family, while still addressing letters to presidents and to the Congress, turning his attention toward ending the war and ending poverty. It was in 1968 that Dr. King organized the Poor People's Campaign. He took his movement to Memphis, where he put together marches to address dismal working conditions. He organized marches to address the indignity imposed upon the black man, and he organized marches to wipe out poverty. He spent a lot of time advocating for jobs, for employment, and this is what brought him to Memphis, Tennessee in April of 1968. On the 3rd of April, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King delivered his last famous speech, the Mountaintop Speech, where he spoke of a promised land that he may never see, but assured us existed. He was 39 years old going up the steps of the Lorraine Motel. He was 39 years old crossing that balcony at the Lorraine Motel. Not knowing what was to come but fearing nothing, his life was snuffed away by an assassin's bullet. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. will always be remembered as one who gave his life, a third of his life to be exact, to serving his community. His dream lives on because it is not yet a reality. We must not let his sacrifice go in vain. We need to remember that he was a young man of 39 when he left us, a husband, a father, a pastor, and a friend. Dr. King is now an iconic ancestor whose statue can be found in places all over the world. He is quite literally considered our stone of hope. Now, as we take up the reins, we must answer the question that he posed. What is life's most persistent and urgent question? What are you doing for others? So in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King, we act. That is why MLK Day is a day of service. Martin Luther King was once quoted as saying, "Everybody can be great because anybody can serve." So how will we serve our communities moving forward? In Dr. King's sermon, Remaining Awake During a Revolution, he spoke about eradicating poverty one hungry mouth at a time. So we here at the Cultural Depot suggest supporting food pantries. It is one of the best ways to directly address the question, what are you doing for others? Plan ahead for next year's MLK Day of Service. Make it a day on and not a day off. Be sure to visit our website, theculturaldepot.com, so you can purchase your Martin Luther King sweatshirt to wear at service events in your community. Thanks again for watching, and please be sure to join us in February for our Black History Month Touchpoint Tuesdays, starting February 1st, every Tuesday thereafter at 6 p.m. Central Time. Hope to see you there.